Welcome to our deep dive, on the 1927 Mississippi River flood. You guys have sent us a really interesting mix of sources, firsthand accounts, news reports from back then, and even a clip from a podcast.
Hmm.
So today we're going to explore not only the flood itself, but how this disaster kind of brought to light social and racial inequalities that already existed, especially for the Black residents of the Mississippi Delta.
Yeah, it's a really interesting look at how a natural disaster can be a turning point in society,
Yeah.
exposing like the existing problems and speeding up things that are already happening, like the Great Migration.
Okay, so let's go back in time. Imagine we're in Greenville, Mississippi. It's April 1927. The Mississippi's already super high from tons of rain, and then boom, it breaks through a levee at Mound's Landing. Why was this breach so bad?
Well, the amount of water that came pouring out was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. I mean, Greenville was flooded in an instant, streets turned into rivers.
Yeah,
One of the firsthand accounts described it as like a glittering, slimy mass of water, filled with debris just sweeping away homes.
that's crazy.
Just total destruction.
The podcast clip we got really
Right.
brought that to life, describing a house being ripped apart and this woman trapped inside. Scary stuff.
Absolutely. And as the flood went further south, people started to panic. It was heading toward big cities, important places like New Orleans. This wasn't just a local problem anymore. It was a full-blown national crisis.
Yeah, national crisis with people stuck on rooftops. I mean, what was the government's initial response?
Well, President Coolidge, he was known for a hands-off approach to things, so he wasn't really eager to jump in.
Okay.
Mississippi's governor, Dennis Murphy, actually had to declare a national emergency to get Coolidge to take action. And that's where Herbert Hoover comes in. He was Commerce Secretary at the time, and people called him the Great Humanitarian.
Hoover had a reputation for handling these kinds of disasters well, but the sources we have also paint him as a pretty complex figure.
Oh, absolutely. Hoover was ambitious, and he knew how to use his public image to his advantage. This flood was like a golden opportunity for him to boost his political career. So yeah, he was driven by humanitarian instincts, but everything he did was also very calculated.
Yeah.
It was a balancing act between helping people and promoting himself.
Interesting. So Hoover decides to let local groups handle the relief efforts. He partners with the Red Cross and gives them a lot of control at the local level. I mean, wasn't that seen as a good thing back then, using local knowledge and all?
Well, yeah, decentralization had its benefits, for sure. Local chapters were closer to the problems, they knew what was needed right away, and they could react faster.
Right.
But it also meant that the relief system could be influenced by local biases and power dynamics.
Oh, I see.
This approach, which was supposed to make things more efficient, ended up having some terrible consequences, especially for Black residents.
Okay. And in Greenville, the relief efforts were led by Will Percy, the son of a really powerful planter, Leroy Percy. It seems kind of unusual for someone with his background to be in charge of the Red Cross.
Will Percy is an interesting guy. He genuinely wanted to help people and tried to live up to his dad's reputation of, taking care of Black residents in that kind of paternalistic way. But at the same time, he was part of the Delta's elite. He was bound by what his family and the planter class expected of him.
I see. Our sources show that in the beginning, things were pretty chaotic, and Black residents ended up taking the lead in rescue efforts. We see people like Will Moore building boats to rescue families who were stranded, and Herman Kalura, who used his modified motorboat to save over 150 people.
Yeah, those acts of courage and selflessness, they often get overlooked in the bigger story. It's important to remember that despite facing the worst of the flood, Black residents played a key role in saving their own communities.
Right. But it seems like this sense of unity fell apart when local planters found out about Will Percy's plan to evacuate people. What were they so worried about?
The planters weren't really concerned about their Black laborers' safety. What they really feared was losing their workforce. One account even describes a big fight where planters put pressure on Will, reminding him that he owed loyalty to his father and to the Delta's economy. They argued that moving everyone out would cripple the region's agriculture, and they couldn't afford that.
So even with this huge disaster happening, they prioritized money over the safety and dignity of Black residents.
It shows a pretty disturbing truth. For the planters, Black lives were only valuable as labor. Their humanity came second to the economic needs of the Delta.
Yeah, that's awful. It's heartbreaking to see this in the source material. Even Leroy Percy, Will's dad, who seemed to care about his workers, ended up siding with the planters.
It really tells you how pervasive this way of thinking was. Even those who saw themselves as being kind were trapped in a system that put profit before people. This system was deeply rooted in the Delta and the flood. Instead of washing it away, just exposed how ugly it really was.
Under all this pressure, Will ditches the evacuation plan, and Greenville becomes a Red Cross distribution hub. But the conditions were really bad, especially for Black residents. What was it like for them?
Well, instead of getting help and support, black men were basically forced to work. They couldn't evacuate, and they had to work on the levees, getting paid with just tiny amounts of food.
Wow.
Armed guards were all over the camps, controlling their movements and using numbered tags to keep track of them.
It's terrible.
Mhm.
The first-hand accounts from Black refugees are really hard to hear. One woman, Matilda Heslop, talks about being denied medical care for her sick child. Another, Sheffield Collins, describes the constant threat of violence from the guards. These stories are so different from the positive narrative we often hear about Hoover's relief efforts.
Yeah, they force us to look at the dark side of how this decentralized relief system worked. While Hoover was getting praised by the press, talking about how efficient and compassionate the Red Cross was, something much darker was happening on the ground.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder, did Hoover know about this abuse? How much did he choose to ignore to protect his image?
It's a big contrast. Hoover's public image versus what Black residents were actually going through in those camps. We'll keep digging into that. It just shows that history is rarely simple. It's full of twists and turns that make us rethink how we understand the past.
It's interesting how Hoover, a man who was, really aware of how the public saw him, how he reacted to all the criticism about the relief efforts. I mean, he didn't just ignore it. He actually took a pretty calculated approach, kind of a political move to try and address things without hurting his reputation.
So how did he try to manage the situation?
Well, he chose Robert Russa Motton, who was a well-known Black educator and leader at the time, to lead an investigation into what was going on in the Red Cross camps.
Picking a respected Black leader to look into potential abuse against Black refugees does seem like a smart move. Hoover could look like he was taking action without actually having to get directly involved.
Exactly. It let him keep a distance while still showing he cared about addressing the problems. And Motton wasn't just a figurehead. He took this job very seriously. He visited lots of camps, interviewed refugees, and carefully gathered evidence.
Given what we've read in these accounts, I can't imagine his report was all sunshine and rainbows about how the Red Cross was running things.
Motton's report painted a mixed picture. It acknowledged some good things about the relief effort, but didn't hold back on showing the bad stuff either. The report pointed out instances of clear discrimination, shortages of supplies, and those exploitative labor practices we talked about.
So now Hoover has this report, which doesn't condemn everything, but definitely shows serious problems with the system he put in place. What does he do?
Well, he tries to walk a fine line. Publicly, he downplayed the report's findings and emphasized how successful the whole relief operation was. But in private letters to Motton, he admitted that things needed to improve. He even suggested some specific changes to address the problems Motton raised.
Sounds like classic political maneuvering, trying to please everyone without causing too much trouble. But meanwhile, back in Greenville, the floodwaters were still rising, and things at the levee camp were getting really tense.
Yeah, it was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. And sadly, that tension led to a tragic event that showed just how raw the situation was. The shooting of Clyde Kennard, a young Black man, by a white guard at the camp.
The sources describing this incident are really disturbing. It's clear that this wasn't just some random act of violence, but a consequence of the deep racial tensions and the unchecked power dynamics in the camps.
The official story was that Kennard was trying to escape, but a lot of Black residents believe he was intentionally killed, targeted for speaking out against the awful conditions. His death sparked outrage and demands for justice from the Black community, but those calls were largely ignored.
It's yet another stark reminder of how systemic racism permeated everything about the response to this disaster. Black voices and Black suffering were constantly dismissed and silenced.
This tragedy further highlights the gap between Hoover's carefully crafted image and what Black residents were actually experiencing. It shows the human cost of playing politics, a cost that falls heaviest on those who are already marginalized and powerless.
Eventually, the floodwaters go down and the immediate crisis is over. What happens to the refugees after the water recedes? Do they just go back to life as it was before the flood?
That's where we start to see the really significant long-term consequences of this disaster. For many Black residents, the flood was a turning point. They were disillusioned by how they were treated in the camps and faced limited opportunities in the devastated Delta, so they made a huge decision to leave.
And this exodus becomes part of what we know as the Great Migration, a major shift in American demographics and culture.
Exactly. The flood acted like a catalyst, pushing Black families to search for better lives and opportunities in cities up north. This massive movement changed the face of urban areas, influenced cultural and artistic expressions, and ultimately redefined the social and political fabric of the country.
It's amazing how a natural disaster, while incredibly destructive in the short term, could also trigger such profound societal change.
The flood didn't just change the physical landscape. It reshaped the social and political landscape as well. It brought to light the deep inequalities woven into American society and fueled a movement for change that would continue to resonate for decades to come.
So we talked about all those Black residents leaving the Delta. It seems like the flood, as awful as it was, also became a kind of turning point for a lot of them. What happened to the Delta itself after everything settled down? Did things actually change, or did they just go back to the way they were before?
The Delta was changed forever, no doubt about it. The flood didn't just show how weak the levees were, it also exposed the deep social and economic inequalities that had always been there.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, they did put a lot of money into fixing things up, making the levees stronger to prevent another disaster.
Okay.
But the real issues, the problems with race and power, those didn't really get addressed.
So it's like a mixed bag. Progress in terms of the physical stuff, but the social landscape stayed pretty much the same.
Yeah, you could say that. The levees were stronger, but the systems that kept inequality in place were still there. Black residents were still facing limited opportunities, discrimination, and that constant fear of violence. The flood had revealed the cracks, but it didn't lead to the kind of deep change that was needed to really fix things.
Earlier, we talked about how those planters were so determined to keep their Black laborers from evacuating. Did they succeed in the end? Did they maintain that control over their workforce?
Not completely. A lot of Black residents did end up going back to the plantations after the flood, but the experience had changed them. The way they were exploited in the camps, the fact that nobody seemed to care about their safety or well-being, all of that created a lot of resentment and a desire for something better. In a way, you could say the flood planted the seeds for change.
So even though those planters were trying to hold on to the old ways, the flood had already shifted things in a way they couldn't control, both physically and mentally.
It's ironic, isn't it? Those planters, so focused on protecting their own interests, might have actually sped up the very changes they were afraid of. Their actions during the flood just fueled the desire for change even more, which ultimately contributed to the exodus of Black labor that would reshape the Delta for years to come.
If we had to pick one main takeaway from all of this, what would you say is the most important long-term impact of the Great Mississippi Flood?
I think it's the clear link between natural disasters and social inequality. The flood didn't create those inequalities, but it made them much worse and impossible to ignore. It forced the whole country, even the world, to confront the fact that race and class have a huge impact on who suffers the most during disasters and who gets access to help.
That's definitely a lesson that's still relevant today, with all the hurricanes, wildfires, and even pandemics we're facing. It seems like the people who are already struggling are always the ones who get hit the hardest.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It gives us valuable insights into what's happening now and can help us create a better future. By understanding how past disasters have made inequality worse, we can work towards a more resilient and compassionate society, one where everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter what challenges come their way.
This has been an amazing journey. We started with a flooded town in Mississippi and ended up talking about race, power, migration, and what it really means to provide disaster relief. It's incredible what you can uncover when you really dig into these historical events.
It shows you how powerful history is in helping us understand the present. The events of 1927 might feel far away, but they still have an impact on the challenges we face today. By learning from the past, by understanding the complexities of these historical moments, we can better equip ourselves to navigate the complexities of the present and build a more just and equitable future.
We've given you, our listener, a look into this complicated and fascinating event. But your exploration doesn't have to end here. What happened to those who moved north? Did the Delta ever truly recover? And what lessons can we learn from both the successes and failures of the relief efforts? Keep asking those questions. Keep digging deeper. That's where the real discoveries are. Until next time, happy diving.